that's really your first impression, I think, of a Mothers of Invention record, is that before you get to the nuts and bolts of how it's constructed, which if you delve into it is pretty interesting, you first of all have all these attitudes to deal with.
The album was neither a major critical or commercial success, but it gained the band a loyal core of followers and has come to be recognized as one of the most important albums in modern music.
It got plenty of reviews, but you know, regardless of what the reviews were like, and most of them were vitriolic, it was symptomatic of the old adage, you know, that all publicity is good publicity. You know, and once again, it's, you know, if you read a review of a record that tears it to shreds, you want to hear that record, you know, yourself to see, you know, why this particular critic thinks it's so terrible.
I think Freak Out's impact might be more substantial on other musicians than it was on the commercial market, at least within a year of its release. Because I think musicians, even if they weren't doing music that was that much like the Mothers, latched onto it immediately as just an example of, we can probably do a lot more than we thought we could in the studio and get away with more. If a label like MGM, which is not especially hip, it's not Elektra Records or Vanguard or Folkways, is letting people do stuff like this, then we might be able to do this at Columbia or at EMI in the UK. And it's often been reported, and I think there's at least some truth to this, that Sgt. Pepper was influenced by Freak Out to some degree. Not that the records were very similar musically, but that the Beatles saw that this band from the West Coast had put out this very strange double album and thought, we can put out a record that's very strange by the standards when you compare it to previous Beatles records, and we can spend a lot of time in the studio, a lot more time actually than Zappa and the Mothers had spent, but do a lot of orchestrations, and we have enough clout to do what we want in this regard, even if EMI might be getting nervous.
I think Freak Out was definitely a sign of things to come. In some ways, Frank Zappa simply remade this record again and again throughout his life. If you take as the key to the record a confrontation between arrantly rubbishy pop music and extremely arcane classical avant-garde music, then that's what every Frank Zappa record in fact does. On the other hand, Frank Zappa himself dismissed the record. He said, now it sounds to me like a bunch of demos. From the technical point of view, Frank Zappa's whole life was involved in perfecting and going further into what recording could do. So for him, it always sounded really crude. It wasn't the kind of record which he was proud of.
After the release of Freak Out, the Mothers toured. Guitarist Elliot Ingber left the band, and Zappa added second drummer Billy Mundy to the lineup.
In November '66, they hired a new drummer, Billy Mundy, who originally had been playing drums for the Monkees. He did a lot of the Monkees tracks. Well, I don't believe he got any credit. You know, they didn't credit him on the records, but that's his claim to fame. He was brought into the fold to be the second drummer, and eventually Jimmy would take on playing trumpet, and Billy would just do the drums.
I didn't know what was going to happen with that because, first of all, I thought it was a mistake for Frank to do it the way he did it because, first of all, Billy and I were too much alike as drummers. You know, and so therefore it was a competition between us. And I really didn't like that. I mean, because why is there a competition between us, man? I mean, we're supposed to be in the same band together. I never could figure it out, but that's the way Billy was. And I never really got along that well with Billy.
Along with Billy Mundy, Zappa also added keyboardist Don Preston, whom he had met on the LA music scene many years earlier, as well as conservatory-trained woodwind specialist Bunk Gardner. Gardner recalls Zappa's audition was not the easiest he had ever attended.
Man, he just kept pulling out music. I had a soprano, I had a flute, I had a bass clarinet, I had a clarinet, I had a tenor saxophone, the bassoon, and he would pull something out and say, play this. And then if I played it, then he would say, well, how fast can you play it? And you know, and I was playing some on piano, some of his stuff, so it was just endless. And I think Frank really enjoyed the audition process because it could show him, you know, where somebody was at. And maybe it was because Frank was kind of self-taught. The way he notated music was not your usual, you know, what you would see playing classical music at the conservatory or whatever, or even jazz-wise. And it just, you know, one thing after another. You know, I mean, Frank could be, he was a workaholic. But again, it just kept going on and on and on and on and on. And then at some point later in the day, he said, well, you think you want to get on board here? So that was basically how it started.
I think when you look at the changing lineups of the Mothers over their first few albums, I think it is true that Frank Zappa probably wanted to expand the tonal colors or the orchestral possibilities of what he could do. That was probably the primary motivation, but I think there's some other things at work. I think that it's not easy to play in a band led by Frank Zappa. This is probably even true before the Mothers had formed, because he had such particular ideas and he was very perfectionist about getting that done. And I think he was a hard guy to get along with in those respects. That was another reason for this kind of changing turntable, really, of so many musicians. He was very fortunate, I think, to have a few that stuck by him fairly faithfully, like Jimmy Carl Black and Roy Ostrada, for several albums, not just one or two. I think it did also reflect that Frank Zappa was a very restless music personality. Like a lot of the great musicians of that time, he didn't want to repeat himself, but also he had ideas that maybe couldn't be done by the same musicians. The Beatles could adapt and play different things as they went along. The Rolling Stones could, The Who could. But with the orchestration Zappa had in mind, you couldn't ask, say, a guy who'd been in the band for just a record or so that might have only been playing a conventional instrument, oh, I want you to play this woodwind or this thing that sounds like a movie soundtrack now. It might have actually been beyond their capabilities. So that was one reason that the lineup expanded, but also why some musicians were replaced.
The Mothers of Invention now had 7 members and were playing increasingly more complex music. In November 1966, the band went back to TTG Studios, where they had recorded Freak Out, to start work on their second album, Absolutely Free.
The album was made up of Absolutely Free and the Mothers of Invention American Pageant, which were the bases of their stage shows at the time. They started recording this at TTG in Hollywood. Now, because of the poor sales of Freak Out, their budget was slashed. I think they only got $11,000 for this budget. And the other thing was they only had 4 6-hour recording sessions to do the record in.
Yeah, I don't know how long we worked because basically Don and I joined not too soon after Freak Out. But, you know, Brown Shoes Don't Make It, and, you know, just a lot of, again, I said, where did this guy get this kind of stuff? There was one song called Call Any Vegetables. It was a very long solo section there. The first take, boy, and, you know, it just kept going on, and I had a real long solo in it, and boy, I thought, boy, I really played good. I hope, you know, we're not going to go to another take one. Anyhow, obviously we did, and the second take was the one that he eventually did. But you know what? There were so many freaks and people in the studio that, you know, it always amazed me how you could get something done. Because when we played in Los Angeles, there was a dance troupe, and all these weirdos and freaks would always come to the concerts, and it was a total entourage of, you know, many, many, many people.
Absolutely Free was released on May 26, 1967. On the album, Zappa incorporated new technology and sounds that had not been used on Freak Out.
Interesting things that Frank did use on Absolutely Free. One was called Sprechgesang, which is speech song. And on Brown Shoes Don't Make It, which is one of the songs that they do use some string instruments on and horns. Actually, Don Ellis, the horn player, guested on there, and so was John Balkin, the string player, who later played on Lumpy Gravy and did some stuff with Bunk Gardner later in life.